Hi, everybody, and welcome to Princess State of Mind, the show where we talk about fiction, fairy tales, and the fairer sex. I'm Faith Moore, and I'm really excited to have with me today Sam Lively. Hi, Sam. Welcome to the show.
Hi.
Hi. So Sam is the author of The Trojan Mouse, How Disney is Winning the Culture War, which I read and really enjoyed, and agreed with a lot of it and disagreed with some of it. So I'm really excited to have you here to talk about it today. So first, could you just kind of tell us a little bit about who you are and why you decided to write this book?
Yeah, well, I was a screenwriter in training for a long time. Never in truth, only in training. But I studied screenwriting in Southern California. I worked briefly in Hollywood, and I started teaching screenwriting at my alma mater. And as over that time, I really developed a perspective on movies and especially narrative, the narrative that drives ideas in movies. So working in the frame, I mean, I'd grown up a culture warrior. I was raised on Francis Schaeffer, on a lot of cultural engagement, Christian writers. And so that was always the way I would approach a story. And as a result of that, I'd always viewed movies a little differently than a generic consumer. So because of that, I developed a pretty strong contrarian take on Disney over the years. And so I decided, after seeing it just become so pervasive, especially with the last few years of Disney's acquisitions, and just starting to see a little bit more of a undeniable slant. I knew some of my earlier takes would not be very mainstream on Disney, but as I saw it really start to evolve in the stuff post 2012, I decided, hey, I think parents, consumers should be aware of some of these things that I'm seeing, and to make a case for a more critical approach to consuming Disney movies, especially for people with young kids who want to make sure that they're not being following the Pied Piper into a completely different ideology than they're trying to raise them in.
Right. So the Trojan mouse, so the Trojan horse elicits an image of something, a pretty package with something deadly inside. So could you sort of explain what this concept is, the Trojan mouse?
Well, if you think of the culture war between, left and right is the old way of looking at it, but I look at it much more in terms of a siege, a culture siege. And you have people who've the conservatives, what I call loyalists, have rallied around a few shared principles, and the revolutionaries, what a lot of people would call the left or progressives, are people who are trying to overthrow those norms and replace them. And so you have this grievance-oriented group versus a loyalty-oriented group of people trying to conserve tradition. And so as a result of that, we have that siege mentality. I think conservatives and Christians in particular have this idea of a sort of a hostile culture that is encroaching further and further, and so they're looking for safe, friendly products, and so as a result, they become very vulnerable to subversive products that have a very happy, wholesome, smiling face. And so Disney, of course, is the ultimate in family consumer brands. You just can't get better quality. You can trust that they're not going to try to sneak in a whole bunch of sex or drugs or violence. But because people become so fixated on those sort of surface challenges to worldview and faith, I think they have missed some of the threats that are lurking inside the narratives themselves. And as a result, that Trojan mouse that looks so appealing on the outside, you usher it into your living room, and your kids and you are watching narratives that promote ideas that you might not be in agreement with.
Right. Okay. So in a nutshell, what is it that you feel like Disney is promoting? What is the worldview that it's promoting right now in this shiny package that we maybe don't actually want our children to be ingesting?
Right. Well, it's what I call a revolutionary worldview. And it's one where it's overthrowing a traditional understanding of social dynamics, of good and evil, and of personal obligations. So you go from an idea of a traditional hierarchy, right, with sort of a Christian style higher power, or really any sort of monotheistic tradition, right? From the Jewish and Christian traditions both have some similarities there. And then working from there, all the hierarchies down, right? So you have man over nature. You have this idea of the parents over the children, of civilization over primitivism. All these ideas these are the hierarchies, right, that have come to be, and all stem from this idea that a Christian or a good God is on top of the whole hierarchical system. So the first thing that they're trying to do is they're trying to overthrow that hierarchy. They're trying to push an idea of a heart-driven world where emotional fulfillment and validation is the ultimate, takes the ultimate place on the hierarchy, and everything else has to fall in line. So that turns children over parents, right? That turns families upside down. It turns societies upside down, where the people who are normally cast out are now actually in charge. The things that you're supposed to delay gratification on now become the things that dominate your entire view of the world. So that would be the main idea I think that Disney is pushing, is this flip, this reversal of the kind of the traditional beliefs that we have about what should be, what's good, what needs to be sacrificed for, and it flips that. So we're instead we have a complete, heroes become villains, villains become heroes, and as a result, the entire worldview kind of gets inverted, I think, from what we traditionally view as a Christian or a conservative worldview.
Gotcha. Okay, I think we're going to find some places where I disagree with you there, but I hear, I definitely just want to establish that, and I hear you what you're saying, because I agree that there is this kind of mentality now of kind of trying to upend everything, and it makes for some interesting stories. But you also talk in your book about the dangers of the kind of typically conservative idea that like there shouldn't be any sort of like, backing away from Disney movies for a second, but like sex and violence in storytelling. And you say that actually that idea that there shouldn't be sex and violence is dangerous. That's sort of a Disneyfying of story.
The surface fixation. And I have to credit Brian Godawa, who is a Christian screenwriter who wrote a book called Hollywood Worldviews. He's one of the first people, I think, to really call attention to that idea of people becoming so worried about sex and violence that they completely forget about the mythological aspect, which is and again, if you understand, people process truth and people process worldviews in two different ways. You have the traditional teaching model, right, which we get in college and at church, which is one person at the front of the room, right, doing exposition, right? This is how the world works, and that is how a lot of us get a lot of our worldview instruction. But we have an emotional side, the language of the heart, where the heart learns worldviews through narrative, through myth. And so regardless of if there's sex or violence in a narrative, it's still instructing people on worldview, on what's good, what's bad, what are the causes and consequences of behavior. And so, I think Brian Godawa was one of the first people to really bring that to my attention, but it's completely true. You can have a ton of objectionable content, and it can be irrelevant really to whatever the mythic content, the worldview content of that story is.
Right. No, I completely agree with you. And so it seems like what you're saying, and I agree with this too, is that, you don't want to just have gratuitous sex and violence in a story in order to titillate or in order to sort of make some sort of point about how, to put our bodies and our sexual desires above our kind of inner drives or above God or whatever. Right. But that like we experience the world through our bodies. And so sometimes that's part of the story that needs to be told. Is that kind of?
I think that's a good summation.
Cool. Okay. So Disney, we know that Disney himself was a Christian, and that played a big part into his particular brand of storytelling. And you talk about how the films that were made under Walt Disney himself are deeply Christian in nature, and I agree with that. Do you think that a story needs to have Christian underpinnings in order to be a good and worthwhile story?
I think in order for it to promote the kind of and again, good is going to be dependent on what I'm going to be a relativist for a parent for a second. Okay. So for a parent, I believe that the authority to pass on a moral tradition is something very sacred, right?
Mhm.
It's something that we should keep within the family. And so for people who are trying to raise their kids in that tradition, I think they should be aware of what a storyteller is bringing in to their family space. And so, yes, I believe that it should be for a proper understanding of good and evil, because I'm a Christian. I believe that starts with a belief in a good higher power. And I don't
Mhm.
think you can have a very coherent definition of good without that. But I don't want to get too much into the philosophical weeds of whether you can or can't. I'm really addressing my my book more to the people who do believe that, who already do share that belief with me, and want to make sure that they are not leading their kids into a different direction through what they're consuming as a family. And so, yeah, if you believe that, then I think it's more important to believe that story can actually change that route, right? If you're consuming a lot of myths that have a different perspective, that eventually that's going to lead to some conflict in your heart to whether to follow what you've been taught, right, expositionally, and with what your heart is now consuming in these mythic narratives.
Gotcha. Yeah. No, that makes sense. And I think it's true that you need to be able, you need to know what a story is actually telling you before you decide whether you want to share it with your
Right.
family or with your children. So back to Disney and his particular brand of storytelling, you talk about how his movies, as opposed to the movies that come after, uh, have within them a death to self narrative. Can
Mhm.
you, which I know is a Christian concept, can
Right.
you talk more about that and what that means within the films?
Yeah, well, I mean, if you look at, like, my favorite's Pinocchio. I
Mhm.
love the golden age, just about every golden age Disney, but the Pinocchio has just such a profound um, world. I mean, the mythic parallels with the Christian worldview are so strong. You've got Pinocchio, who is this brand new creation and has to go out about, so basically in pursuit of an immortal soul.
Mhm.
And he's got to, in order to get there, he's got to deal with temptation in the form of Honest John and the Coachman and Pleasure Island. So he's got all these temptations that are leading him away from the straight and narrow, away from the still small voice, the Jiminy Cricket, the JC, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
So it's this pretty explicit Christian allegory for an individual having to choose between pursuit of the heart, right, pursuit of immediate gratification in sinful, right, areas,
Right.
versus a voyage of self-sacrifice and fidelity to the principles that he's been passed on. So, and of course, so Pinocchio goes astray numerous times, and then his route to redemption is through that very Christian redemptive self-sacrifice. The idea that he can only become a real boy by sacrificing, right, by dying to the
Mhm.
old self,
Mhm.
and being willing to lay down that life for the higher power. And he does that, and he's rewarded, and we get that very happy ending. But it doesn't feel like a self-fulfilling, right? He very much fulfilled somebody else's, a higher power's moral command for him to behave. That was what ultimately produced that happy ending for Pinocchio.
Well, it's tricky, right? Because he also gets what he wants out of that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he has to sacrifice in
Right.
order to become a real boy, because in becoming a real boy, he has to develop a conscience and in this
Right.
particular narrative also a sort of connection to a higher power, and he has to sacrifice, but that is also what he was after in the first place, was to become
Right.
a hero,
And
right?
you can see that too with the princesses too, the Golden Age princesses. So if you start with Snow White, she has a desire. I mean, someday my prince will come, right? She has
Yeah.
this desire to have this relationship. And in fact, that's that desire that ends up leading her. A lot of people kind of poo-poo the Disney princesses as completely passive, but she actually does make some key decisions
Oh,
in the
totally.
story,
Yeah.
for good and bad, right? And one of them is the decision to eat the apple, right?
Mhm.
Which is very biblical again,
Right.
forbidden fruit, and the she eats it and falls under the spell. So it is the goal, like the desire. She wants the relationship. She wants the prince, and it's through that the immediate gratification leads her astray, just like it did with Pinocchio. And then it's through that, again, dependence on grace and the redemptive self-sacrificial element. In that case, it's not her sacrifice so much as it is the more Christ-like sort of prince archetype coming in and sacrificing, and the not necessarily, but redeeming on her behalf, that leads to her ultimate gratification. So yeah, I think you have a good point there, that it is ultimately about gratification either way. It's just a question of time. Are you going to go for immediate gratification? Are you going to follow your heart, or are you going to follow the wisdom of the traditions that have been passed down to you and follow their journey towards getting that ultimate thing that you want?
Right. Well, I guess where I come a little into conflict with this is that I think that these stories, even these sort of original Golden Age stories, and I'm looking mostly at the princesses, but I agree about Pinocchio and some of these other narratives that come before. I think that for a princess anyway, for a Disney princess, her motivation is almost always to become who it was that she felt she was meant to be. I mean, it's a growing up story most of the time. She's a girl and she has to go through some sort of challenge and becomes a woman at the other end. And the original fairy tales from which these movies come are all about that. They're all about becoming women. And I think there is at the heart of a lot of these stories this idea that there's something that I'm meant to be, it could even be like that God, some way that God meant for me to be, that I currently am not. And I have to figure out how to do that. And often, as you say, it comes through sacrifice. And I also think it's a kind of American idea, right? That we have the power to make ourselves into whatever it is that we think we're supposed to be. So I'm wondering, where does the sort of negative piece come in for these narratives, where it stops being this higher ideal and becomes something more worldly? Right.
Well, I mean, it starts, again, if you look at the revolutionary ideas, they always start from a place of legitimate grievance, right? So if you look at, if you look at people's grievances over Disney princesses from the Golden Age, it's always they're too passive, they're too dependent on these Prince Charmings to come in and ride in and rescue them. So it produces this mentality of sort of docile, domestic 1950s femininity, where you just sit around vacuuming, waiting for somebody to sweep you off your feet. So and so that grievance, right? That grievance of this sort of narrow cult of femininity leads to the beginnings of a Disney revolution in the way it treats princesses. And so again, if you look at the Disney Renaissance, right, it starts in shortly after Eisner and Katzenberg and Wells take over Disney in the 80s, you get a shift, a pretty subtle at first, but I think fundamental shift that then produces some of the more, I would say, universally objectionable to Christians and conservatives, what the modern princesses are doing in Frozen 2 and movies like that. So if you look at Ariel sort of is the ground zero for the revolutionary take on the princess. So if you compare Ariel to Cinderella, to Snow White, to Aurora, she is a very, she's not a scholarly maid, right? She's not humble. She's not modest. She's defiant. She is very self-assured, very much driven by the desires of her heart in an active protagonist role, not a passive singing, hopefully this is going to change. She takes steps. She moves to change her situation. But interesting, Little Mermaid takes a big step back. Instead of becoming a story of feminist empowerment, it actually is, I think, a cautionary tale, because she goes to Ursula, right? She undermines her father's patriarchal authority to try to pursue her heart's desire. and that backfires pretty spectacularly. Even though she gets the prince, she ends up unleashing Ursula, who's this sort of and I think a unintentional allegory for what Disney would become. You could really look at Ursula as the modern mascot of Disney in terms of all the things that Ursula wants. You can see now actually becoming valorized, becoming positive with Elsa and characters like Princess Vanellope in the Wreck-It Ralph series. So you have the Little Mermaid, I think, is the first one. You can see where they're starting to flirt with that idea of a princess who overthrows an oppressive regime and becomes the queen, not by being redeemed, right? Mm-hmm. But actually by throwing off the chains of her oppressors herself. And those oppressors almost necessarily then become representatives of the old conservative order.
Okay, so here's my problem with this. I think that the thing that Ariel wants, which is to be human, is what I was talking about before. It's that she feels she was born to be a certain thing. Like she was born to a family of doctors and she feels like she should be a concert pianist or something like that. She has dreams that she feels she was meant to achieve, and she's being told, no, you can't do that. You can't even try. There's no way that you can possibly do this. And because of that, she makes a bunch of questionable choices because it's kind of her only way to do that. And that does backfire, except that in doing that, she kind of alerts her father to the fact that maybe there was something there that he wasn't really paying attention to. Because as parents, we need to accept that our children are who they are, and we shape them and we teach them, et cetera, et cetera. But as long as their thing that they want to do is not dangerous, then, a lot of times we have to kind of help that. Right. So
and myth doesn't have to be completely black and white in that respect, but it does matter who wins, right? What the consequences ultimately are. So the reason I view Little Mermaid as a sort of a flirtation and then a step back, right, is because it gives legitimacy to her grievances, right? Her father is overbearing. He destroys her little completely innocent little trophy.
Right.
I mean, it's sort of this traumatizing scene, but it's ultimately what the story is recommending, right, is that she made a pretty big mistake in going to the enemy, right, of the traditional order, the traditional patriarchal order. She went to the ultimate enemy of it to get personal satisfaction. So she betrayed her father because her father had erred, right? So it's taking an individual grievance and then using it to upend what was a pretty stable social order. And that is to me, that's a pushback against the revolutionary idea, which is that all these people who have legit grievances, but on a small scale, are then willing to overthrow an entire system to get their own way. And regardless of what is going to happen, why that system was even in place in the first place. So I thought that was again, showing that a patriarch could be abusive in a way, and that the daughter had legitimate complaints against him, but at the same time that she went way too far in trying to overthrow a system to get justice in what was a much smaller category.
But isn't it a child, or let's say a teenager's job, to overthrow the order, the world order?
That's what they think their jobs. I have 2 daughters and 1 more on the way, so I'm a little worried about the stage. But
I also don't mean like, isn't it their job to be super annoying and like angsty? What I mean is, isn't it kind of the job of a young adult going out into the world to kind of overthrow not the system, but to kind of break free from, because my thing about a lot of these princess movies is that one of the problems that the princesses are always kind of pitted against in the more traditional movies that I approve of is the corruption of motherhood. They've got these wicked stepmothers usually who, for whatever reason, can't allow them to grow up. So Snow White can't grow up because if she does, she'll become more beautiful than queen. Cinderella can't grow up because if she does, she'll leave the home and she'll stop cooking and cleaning, and on and on and on. So it's the job of those princesses to kind of break away from that.
From illegitimate authority. And that is the key difference, is that the corruption of the father or maternal figure creates a legitimate. I thought Tangled does a very good job of this.
Yeah.
Tangled takes a illegitimate maternal figure, but instead of doing what Ariel did and trying to overthrow like the entire system, she is trying to right a individual injustice and restore the natural order, right? So I think the teenage rebellion, the healthy version of it is leave and cleave, right? That's the biblical way of looking at it. The leave and cleave, and that you have to break from your family, but not to break families, to create a new family. So yes, there is a little bit of painful growth and separation that has to take place, and then sometimes that's going to involve some type of overthrow, right, of illegitimate attempts to gain control. But ultimately, it's to recreate a very similar social order with a new person. And so that is something that you'll notice changes pretty quickly as Disney moves through the Renaissance and into the revival, is that instead of the break with the old, the unjust, there's actually an overthrow of the entire order. And we get, to varying degrees, a celebration of that overthrow. So we take pleasure in the revolution itself, not in the recreation of that really beautiful model of man and woman, right? Family, the family is the castle, the nuclear family is the castle, which is the golden age ideal that Disney was promoting.
Right. Yeah, I'll take that point. I mean, I think like we could probably go back and forth a little bit more, but I see what you're saying about the difference. And I also think there are sort of two levels always that you can view these movies. And one of them that I often take issue with is the elements that they choose to put in the movie. So like they chose to make Triton particularly unable to understand his daughter's desire to explore the human world, which they didn't have to do. He could have been much more reasonable. And I mean,
but ultimately they made him good too, right? I mean, he makes that. I mean, he really steals the story in the third act with his sacrifice.
Right. He's the one that goes through.
Is remarkable, and it justifies the old order, even though he wasn't a great dad throughout. He ultimately justifies the goodness of the father, which again I think goes back to that Christian ideal of both social structure and sort of spiritual ideas of the male God figure, which also he doubles as sort of deity and dad.
Right, exactly.
So, but the one I think that we're probably going to get the most fun debating is probably Beauty and the Beast. I think you're a big fan of that, right?
Great. I was just about to go there. Sorry, what did you say?
You're a big fan of Beauty?
I'm a huge fan of Beauty and the Beast. You probably know.
Beautiful movie. It's a beautiful movie.
It's a beautiful movie, and I do disagree with a lot of your things. But so yeah, what I was going to say is you kind of point. So I agree with you that Little Mermaid is the place where you start to see this shift. But you kind of put the pin in Beauty and the Beast as the place where the Trojan Mouse rears its ugly.
Right.
So why?
Well, and again, I'm taking a bit of a contrarian take on Beauty and the Beast. Not necessarily. I think you can actually read Beauty and the Beast differently than I did, pretty easily, and justify that. But because I did quite a bit of reading, I learned a lot about Linda Wolverton, who was the screenwriter who Katzenberg brought in to really bring the female voice and the feminist voice to the Disney princess. And if you look at it from Wolverton's perspective, not necessarily the consumer's perspective, the consumer wasn't necessarily getting what she was selling. But she really did. She basically laid a foundation in Beauty and the Beast that could then be used for revolutionary purposes, even if a consumer of Beauty and the Beast didn't notice or didn't buy what she was putting in there. I think it had a huge effect that once you look back on what came after Beauty and the Beast, you can start to appreciate more of the contrarian take that I put on it. So yeah, when I view the biggest problem, if you go to this idea of binding the strong man. Again, I use a lot of Bible verses, but I think it's applicable outside of just a Christian context. But the idea of a strong man who's upholding this traditional order, and Triton was obviously that. in Little Mermaid. But in Beauty and the Beast, we introduce three versions. We have Maurice, the dad, we have Beast, and then we have Gaston.
Yep.
And so they range, right? Maurice is inherently good. He's a good, loving father, but he's incompetent.
Right.
I mean, the three big scenes of Maurice, right? His first big scene, he gets knocked out by his own machine.
Yeah.
His second big scene, he gets he trespasses and gets thrown into jail.
Yeah.
And then his third
lost, and then he does that. Yeah.
Well, that
first he gets like completely lost, right?
He gets lost. That's right. And then in his third big scene, he gets thrown into the lunatic asylum.
Right.
So it's like it's a very emasculating journey for Maurice,
yes.
And not in a way that I think most people pick up, because they just think, oh, it's just the bumbling, likable dad. Everybody can relate to that. But it's so aggressive to me, the way that they basically punish him. It's not in a way that because he's bad, but it's because he needs to be out of the story for it to work. He needs to be diminished so that Belle, right, has to sort of step up to the plate, because her dad can't do any of the things that Triton did or that the princes had done in previous Disney stories. He's just completely incapable of performing that role. So Belle has to step up. Then you look at Beast. Beast is sort of the duality of a man. He's got the male chauvinist side that's very it's given that literal representation of the beast, right? The guy who's snarling, uncouth, unkempt, no manners, no sympathy, no respect. And then this other side that she has to unlock, which is the sympathetic, the heroic, the self-sacrificial side. And I think there's a lot of good in there. There's a lot of good symbolism in there. But the way that I think Wolverton was approaching it was this idea of toxic masculinity, and this idea of a rival to a feminist empowerment, right? So an enemy to feminist empowerment, and that Beast's journey is really one of domestication, that where he has to rid himself, and he has to ultimately kill his alter ego in Gaston, to reveal a much a sensitive '90s guy on the other side. And it's not. I mean, it's not. Again, I don't think see it as inherently bad. I think of it as a stepping stone. That it's one thing to try to challenge this heroine in Belle, and try to force her to deal with the very real problems of a insufficient father and a bad man. But the way that she does it, she has to diminish the patriarch. She has to shrink him down into like a ridiculous simpleton, and then she has to demonize the masculinity by making it beastly on one side, and then boorish through Gaston. And Gaston is really the ultimate caricature of masculinity. It's very much like the bimbos at the beginning of Beauty and the Beast, how they caricature sort of the femininity. It's a view of traditional masculinity that's very, very hostile, very I think propagandistic in the way that it starts to get people to think of traditional masculinity as a threat, as something that should be cast aside as part of our old barbaric tradition. And we can then move forward into this new era of an empowered feminist hero whose man can be strong. Yes, Beauty and the Beast, he can be strong, but he's put on the path to where he's going to progressively diminish, so that the female heroine can take the leadership and both the spiritual, moral, and physical mantle of heroism going forward.
Okay, so I totally take your point about Maurice, and I think also, this situation where the father, it starts with Little Mermaid, and it moves on where the father is either sort of too overbearing, or after this it becomes like the father is trying to get the princess to marry a certain guy. That's what comes after Beauty and the Beast, is like over and over again these dads are like, this is the guy you have to marry. So I agree that there's two of them. There's the overbearing Triton like one, and then there's the bumbling idiot like Maurice and like the
Oh,
Sultan
yeah,
from Aladdin. So I totally take your point there. Here's my problem
sure.
with this characterization of the Beast and Gaston. So to me, the Beast is all about what men do with the fact that they are men, that they have these urges, right? Because when, you know, women have the urges that women have and men have the urges that men have. And so they have these like, you know, sexual urges and these aggressive urges and all of these things. And what do you do with those? And the answer that I think the movie tells us is you channel them in service of love.
Right.
And you know, the Beast to me doesn't really ever get emasculated, and
Right.
Belle to me never ever asks him to do anything to change. You know, she doesn't even know. She doesn't know he's a prince. She doesn't know he could change. She's like, I'm stuck in the castle with this horrible guy, and then suddenly he starts to be nicer, and she has no idea why.
Right.
And I think so. I think, you know, all of the critiques, and I know you didn't actually say particularly this, but all of the critiques that, like, you know, it's all about changing a man. It's like, well, no, Belle doesn't actually ever do anything. It's just that the Beast realizes that there's a way to elevate this beastliness. You know, he's been turned into a beast because he hasn't channeled all of this stuff and he's just being really awful. And you know, there's a way to elevate this and not actually get rid of it, which some of the later Disney movies promote. There's the way to channel this into service of something good. And Gaston is the sort of other example where he does not have within him a prince. You know, there's the prince and the beast, and the Gaston's just a beast. And, you know, he can't ever change, whereas the Beast has within him this concept of the gentleman. You know, I really like how in the movie they're talking about you must be a gentleman, because the idea is you are big and strong and powerful, and what you should do with that is you should save her from some wolves, not leave people out in the cold or whatever. So I guess I take issue with this idea that like he becomes somehow this kind of subservient character to Belle because
no, you're right. He does. He acts as he is able to channel that power in the service of something good.
Right.
And I don't mean Beauty and the Beast to serve as like the ultimate example of this kind of subversion. I really was talking about the foundation really that's underpinning what they started. And again, with the Beast, you can view it again like Triton as the beginning of the shrink ray, the patriarchal shrink ray. Honey, I Shrunk the Patriarch. And it's incomplete. So he retains a lot of the classic virtues. But if you look at the changes that they made to the fairy tale, and you read Wolverton's own interviews on the subject, you can start to see what she was doing and how it paid off in future stories. And what she's doing, if you look at the Enchantress in the original fairy tale version of the Belle et Bête, the French versions, the Enchantress is evil, and not someone who's trying to benefit. But in the Disney version, the Enchantress is actually good. It's this sort of this curse. Instead of the curse going on Eve, right? The curse goes on Adam, and it comes from a Enchantress who's trying to break him of his power, right? They're trying to remove him from that pedestal that he occupies. And again, I think you can make a very different reading of Beauty and the Beast. You can even look at it biblically. If you look at the story of Nebuchadnezzar becoming a beast, right, and having to learn humility as a result of that, this prince being forced to learn humility. So I think there's a lot of good in there. I just wanted to draw people's attention to what I see as that foundation being laid. You can then see with Aladdin, you can see it much more explicitly.
Yeah. So what I was sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so if you look at Jasmine versus if you go from Ariel to Belle to Jasmine, you can see a little bit like more and more aggressive presentation of the heroine in each case. Where it's Ariel, she's in love, right, and she's willing to do anything for love, including stupid things for love. With Belle, you have this very conscientious. We get a little bit of that sort of elitist versus provincial thing with her, where she wants to leave behind the provincial life, but for the most part she's a pretty modest heroine. She doesn't take things in stride quite like a Cinderella would, but she's a pretty good model for I would say for somebody being willing to take on challenges without becoming a grievance monster, you know. But then as soon as we get to Jasmine, you get sort of the worst attributes, I think, of Ariel.
Yes.
And Belle, in that she's very much like Ariel. She has almost no humility, no grace for anybody causing any sort of obstruction for her. She just doesn't even consider the possibility that there might be a reason to go with tradition.
Right.
And then you have the Sultan is the ultimate descent in patriarchy. He's just a total idiot and completely incapable on every level. And then you have with Aladdin, you also have the lowest version of the prince. So we went from Prince Eric, who's sort of a side character in a lot of ways, but is good and noble, virtuous, has that sort of Christ-like heroic role. The Beast, who on some subtle ways, right, gets turned into a little bit different than what I view as the Christian archetype, but ultimately still gets that self-sacrificial, that powerful role. And then with Aladdin, now we have a thief, an unrepentant thief, really. I mean, somebody who's actually celebrated for being outside of the traditional order. And his big mistake is actually trying to become legitimate. I mean, that's the whole thing. Is like, it's like they frame it as truth, but it's really much more of like a betrayal of his revolutionary origins. He's trying to act like a prince when Jasmine doesn't want a prince. She wants to overthrow the system. And she found this great thief guy who was willing to overthrow with her, and then he decided to sell out to the man, right, and lost his desirability. So the Aladdin, I think, really is if you look at all the seeds that are planted in Little Mermaid and Beauty and the Beast, you can really see them come to fruition in Aladdin, which ironically has become the black sheep of the Disney Renaissance family because it sort of preceded the multicultural problems that had began to consume the revolutionary cause, but then they were just focused on patriarchy and feminism, and they didn't really anticipate, we might be stepping on some multicultural toes by the Arabs, a bunch of hand chopping brutes.
Yeah, no, and I totally take your point about looking at what Wolverton was trying to do, because, you know, I tend to put the Disney princes into two categories: the Prince Charmings and the Beasts. And I think that the Beast is a really interesting portrayal of something that doesn't actually play out in the other characters that fall into this category. I do think it's still this category of like this guy that isn't quite right. He's not quite what we want him to be, whoever we are and whatever that is. And he needs some kind of change. And Aladdin definitely falls into that category. But to me, the difference between the Beast and Aladdin is that Jasmine is actively out there being like, everything that you are is completely wrong. And in order to be with me, you've got to change. And he's like, oh no, okay, I will be everything you ever wanted me to be. Yeah. And Belle is not doing that at all. And the Beast is kind of on his own journey to figure that out. But I think, and so the Beast category, princes deal with this in different ways. You know, Flynn Rider is another one that falls into this category, but has more of a kind of sympathetic.
And he's more empowered too, because he's actually taking a redemptive arc of his own. The problem with Aladdin is a pure-hearted son of the revolution who loses his way, right, out of love for a girl, and then ends up rediscovering that he was great all along. Which is not a true moral arc. That's I call it self-esteem punk. It's like this idea that that really the ultimate journey is discovering that you are virtuous and right. That's the end of the hero's journey is, hey, I'm great, actually. I don't need to improve. And so I like the Flynn Rider character much better because he takes that thief archetype, and it's actually bad. He's actually a bad guy. He wrongs everybody around him, and only through the redemptive aspect of love, right? Not the the indulgent view of love that Aladdin takes. He ends up, which she also takes that same route. So they have that sort of mutual parallel redemption journey that I think is quite touching and tangled. But was completely butchered in Aladdin, because Aladdin is really just a whole new world right? Look at what it celebrates. No one to tell us no or where to go,
Right.
right? It's
Right.
just a pure sort of teenage anarchy, the teenage
Mhm.
heart elevated to be the ultimate god of the universe. And as long as we can just do whatever we want, then everything else will fall into place.
Yeah, that'll work.
And that's literally what happens in the story. They
Yeah,
just learned, hey, if I just did what I wanted all the time and just didn't worry about what other people thought or what tradition expected of me or what morality expected of me,
Mhm.
then everything would work out fine.
Right.
And which is, I think, a pretty destructive view, but ironically, not really that bad when you compare it to some of the stuff that Disney's doing now.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think it was interesting to see in the live action version of Aladdin that they actually amped up his thiefness. Like in the original, it's sort of like we're supposed to be like, well, he's starving, so it's fine. He can steal some bread, which obviously I don't think, but that we're supposed to kind of be like, well, what is he supposed to do? And
Right.
then he gives the bread to the children, so we're like, oh, okay.
Right.
But I felt like in the live action version, he's actually like a con man, and he's like a pickpocket, and he takes random things from people, and it's part of his flirtation with Jasmine that he is able to steal stuff off of her body and give it back to her later. So yeah, I think that is definitely, I totally agree with that.
And the live action makes a great because what's interesting is they barely did anything to the live action Beauty and the Beast. It feels like a shot for shot remake with a bunch of deleted scenes tacked on. But with Aladdin, you can see the cultural paradigm shift, right? With the Sultan, right? The Sultan is no longer an idiot in the new one. He's just, in fact, that's part of what they had to do, and you can see that a patriarch is okay as long as it's not a Western patriarch.
Right.
It's not somebody who's upholding the Western order, because that's obviously what has to be overthrown. But a patriarch's okay if it's from a non-Western cultural tradition, even though they have to do some magical thinking to make it work, where he's a powerful, dignified patriarch, but he's also an enlightened feminist patriarch.
Yes.
And sort of hands over the sultancy to Jasmine.
Right.
At the same time, we also get with the relationship with Aladdin and Jasmine, right? They really try to dig into that idea of this millennial couple, right? Who is overthrowing the backwards ways of their prior generations and really embracing their that heart-driven narrative of simultaneous feminist empowerment and rejection of old moral strictures about stealing and in sacrificing for other people's benefit instead of for your own.
Yeah, I mean, I also think that they had to make the Sultan less of a horrible, idiot in order to pit. So Jasmine is sort of pitted against the Sultan in a sense, in that she wants to be the Sultan, the next Sultan. So she wants to be his job when he dies. But if he was an idiot, then anyone could do his job. So why not a woman? But
it had to be a worthy opponent, right?
Powerful figure, then it matters more that she's able to take that job. But okay, so we're going to run out of time, and I don't want to leave before we talk about now the sort of last where we are now with Disney. And my entry to this is Frozen, because as much as I really dislike the messaging of Frozen 1 in particular, it is very clear to me that it is a cultural phenomenon, and that it has captured the hearts and minds of little girls everywhere. And
I'm included.
Yeah, right. If I ever stop having Let It Go in my head, I'll probably be dead. So I think my question is, are we all just now completely indoctrinated, and that's why this has permeated our lives in this way? Or is there something good about this? What's going on in Frozen, and why does it appeal to us, or to little girls, so much?
Well, it's very powerful combinations. That's what allows, again, the Trojan Mouse concept depends on something appealing, something beautiful and virtuous that lowers people's defenses and gives them something legitimately good to grab onto. So there are things about Frozen that I think fill a need. I mean, you have all these sort of butt-kicking princesses, and yet in Frozen, they're not aggressive, they're not angry, they're very, I mean, they're demure, they love each other. It's about sisterly bonds, it's about, I mean, pretty dresses, it's about balls, it's about discovering, like balancing sort of desire with responsibility, all these sort of classic narrative arcs that I don't think there's anything wrong with those. And that's what makes it so attractive. I mean, it feels almost like a return to tradition. I mean, it's like a Downton Abbey in Norway kind of setup. And so all that is, but again, it takes advantage of the surface orientation and the genre orientation of consumers. We gravitate to things that look pretty, that are aesthetically pleasing,
right,
and that hit the right narrative peaks and valleys, right, that we come to expect. But it's not on a narrative level from a moral perspective. It's using those peaks and valleys to undermine what I would consider traditional values and to emphasize the more revolutionary ideas. So you end up getting the same thrills, right? The same dopamine rush that you get from watching a classic, because they're hitting all the same buttons, but they're hitting them at different points in the narrative. And so you're ending up cheering for something that is actually runs counter to the traditional values that it looks like it's espousing. So a lot of people celebrated Frozen because it seemed like it was taking on this idea of teen love, right? The idea that Anna is following her heart and knows everything and goes for Prince Hans with like a 2-hour engagement. Right. And it is all shocked when the traditional authority figure, Elsa, is skeptical. So that again, that's a legitimate positive spin on it. But if you look at what's actually going on in Frozen, Frozen is about two things. It's about Elsa becoming a matriarch, in a empowered feminist queen, who is going to let go a idea of a patriarchally defined goodness to define her own goodness, which is what Let It Go is all about. A lot of people thought Let It Go is actually something that isn't good when you look at the ultimate story, but if you look at the actual way they wrote that story, originally that story was going to be about Elsa fighting the snow golem that she created. So she would have to be joining with her town in destroying the thing that she created in a moment of anger, empowerment. So it would have been a very Little Mermaid style arc in that sense, and it would have fit in with what else John Lasseter was doing at Disney. He actually was pretty conservative with both Princess and the Frog and which I so the little oasis of conservatism in modern Disney is those two movies. But the if you look at what it does instead of the snow golem and her ice castle creation being a representative of excess and devastating grievance, it actually is justified and empowering. And when she comes back, so instead of making her momentary flirtation with darkness, right? Instead of making that the problem, who is the problem? Who is the bad guy in Frozen? Prince Hans, who again was not originally the villain in the story. They make Prince Hans, and this becomes very symbolic of what modern revolutionary progressivism seeks to do. Is it needs a bad guy. It needs a bad guy, and the best bad guy is the white patriarch in training, the one who's trying to hold on to this old white supremacist power structure and is going to undermine any threat to that structure. So any strong women have to be taken down, and so Elsa has to be undermined by the Duke of Wesselton and Hans, and then Anna has to be tricked into marriage. And marriage, instead of becoming a redemptive institution, becomes a enslaving institution that will kill her, choke her off, and kill her, and return the kingdom to the rule of these evil white males. And so again, if you look at it from that perspective, yes, there are good things going on in Frozen. There's some things to celebrate, but that narrative core takes a really strong turn into some of the most, I think, dangerous progressive grievances out there, which is just pretty much hatred of white male authorities and the exaltation of a feminist matriarchal alternative.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think also it's kind of the culmination of something which I also track along these same lines, which is the literalization of all of these stories that were never meant to be taken literally. So all of these original fairy tales are they're metaphors meant to teach children about universal things. For example,
Right.
I mean, Snow White, we didn't get to this, but Snow White has within it an allegory about going through puberty and becoming a woman and becoming ready to bear children.
Right.
And the whole concept of love at first sight is not ever, I think, meant to be taken as like, the way that you're going to know who to marry is you're going to see him across a crowded room. And if you don't feel that way, then he's not the right one. I think it's more of a depiction of soul recognizing soul, and that in real life that might happen through lots of dates or like lots of conversations or whatever. But in a fairy tale and in those original movies that adhered much more closely to the fairy tales, it depicts that in this symbolic love at first sight.
No, that's a very good point.
And I think that in Frozen, what you get is this depiction of like, if that really happened, that would be really bad. If you just decided to marry a guy you fell into a boat with one day, you shouldn't. And isn't that awful? And see how all those other Disney princesses did that and see how wrong it is. Because what gotcha, he might turn out to be a murderous psychopath. And really, you should get to know each other first. And I think that taking everything too literally is something that has happened in our culture in general, but also in the reading of these films that has sort of derailed everything.
And there is one thing I wanted to come back to that you brought up. And you talked about, is it too deeply ingrained now? Is it just the world we're living in?
Right.
And I think a part of that, and this is why I went back to the Renaissance, because I think you have to sort of deprogram at a certain level to be able to understand why Frozen has that hold on people. And what happened in the Disney Renaissance was the overthrow of traditional authority and the replacement of that with the teenage heart. Teenage heart ruled Disney Renaissance. But what that leaves out is that sort of hedonistic way of thinking lacks the religious impulse. And what we're starting to see now in this Disney revival is the return of religious impulse. But because it cannot be the Christian religious impulse, because that implies a return to a lot of these oppressive norms, it has to be a new kind of religion. And that's what the Great Awakening is. It's a religion that needs new definitions of good and evil, because it can't just be about, I followed my heart and everything went right. We need to tell these big epics again. We need to tell of these stories of queens overthrowing demonic powers. And so that's added this dangerous new element of taking old fairy tales, which are very much like parables in the way that they're teaching people about good and evil. And instead of just saying, oh, forget the stupid good evil aspect, we're just going to have fun, which is a lot of the Renaissance does, it's now saying, yes, we're still going to have fun, right? We're going to have that message of empowerment, but we're also going to elevate that to a religious level. And we're going to define new angels and demons in this world. And the demons are almost exclusively going to be evil white males. And you can see that with Wreck-It Ralph. Wreck-It Ralph is really about white males coming to terms with their own villainy in the new order. I mean, Ralph has to realize I'm the bad guy and that's okay. Turbo, right? King Candy, I can't remember his name. I think it was Turbo / King Candy has to realize, or never realize that, and as a result becomes metastasized. This horrible villain who's going to ruin everything. Frozen 2 was huge on that. The evil in the world all flows back to the old granddad,
the patriarch, right?
And the only way to rectify all that evil white colonialist oppression is to turn Elsa into a literal goddess, and it becomes the new protector and deity, protecting Arendelle from the sins of its past. So it becomes very religious. It becomes very different from just the hedonistic, do what you want parables of the Renaissance. And now it becomes a sort of post-Christian religion that inverts all the Christian heroes, turns them into villains to allow for these new revolutionary heroes to take on sainthood. And I think it's just dangerous stuff. I mean, as it gets more explicit, I think it's going to start driving people away.
Agreed.
A lot of those roots are in there right now, and
Yep.
so people are being forced to look back. Like, I'm uncomfortable with this, but I bought into this idea of liberation, right? Liberating the heart from all the oppressive norms. I don't want to go back to those norms. So what else is there? And so they become, I think, much more susceptible to that religious propaganda because they've already had the emotional propaganda that's been really built into them. So parents who sympathize with Jasmine and sympathize with Pocahontas, right? They're going to be much less willing to take a hard stand on Frozen because they've already been halfway purchased. And then their kids are going to be less willing to take stands down the line because they've already ingested Frozen, and they're going to be willing to take an even further leap forward based on that priming.
Agreed. Well, we are out of time, and I think the way that people should figure all of this out is to buy your book. It is called, here, I'll put it up again. It's called The Trojan Mouse, How Disney is Winning the Culture War. And there's a link to buy it in the description of this video. Where else can people find you?
There's a Facebook page on The Trojan Mouse on Facebook. And also on Twitter, you can follow me, Samuel P. Lively. I try to do these Disney dossiers. I'm slow in my uptake, but I'm trying to keep track with the new stuff that's coming out to give people a breakdown. Again, I come at it from a very contrarian perspective, so expect to disagree, but you'll at least get to see from that screenwriter's perspective what narratives are being pushed forward, and you can go in with clear eyes and know what the storyteller is going to be pushing across. And then you can, that doesn't mean you have to boycott these things. It just means you can then have the discussions that really defang a lot of that emotional appeal that happens when people are going in just assuming it's entertainment and not realizing, hey, these are morality tales. These are Sunday school lessons just in emotional cocaine form, and they pack quite a wallop. So.
Excellent. Well, it's been a pleasure talking to you, and I really appreciate you coming on here. And
thanks, Faith.
And hopefully we'll get to chat again soon.
All right, great.